Introduction. A promise of transformation. The wind howled through the empty streets, whispering secrets only the shadows knew. The cold, biting air swept across the desolate landscape, as if nature itself had forsaken this place. There, on the edge of the village, stood a house, no longer grand, no longer filled with the laughter and light that had once filled its halls. Now, it was but a hollow shell, burdened with the weight of its own history. And in this house, Laurent sat at the edge of his once ornate fireplace, staring into the flickering flames as if they held the answers to his fractured existence. It was a life that had slipped through his fingers, like sand in the wind. A life that had once gleamed with the promise of prosperity. Now, his fortune lay at the bottom of the sea, a tragic reminder of how fragile the world could be. He had lost everything: his wealth, his standing, his dignity, and worst of all, he had lost his place in the world. But amidst the shadows of defeat, a faint light still flickered. His youngest daughter, Camille, stood by him, her presence a silent testament to the love they shared. She was the one who had not been swayed by the weight of their ruin, the one who had remained steadfast as the others faltered. As the world around them crumbled, Camille had embraced the struggle. She had learned to bake bread, to sew, to garden, skills that once seemed beneath her, but which had now become the foundation of their survival. She had faced the storm with a quiet strength, never complaining, never wavering. But beneath that strength, there was a quiet yearning, an ache that even Camille couldn't name. She had longed for something more than the confines of their humble cottage, more than the dreariness of the days spent scraping by. She had dreamed of something better, something grander. She had dreamed of a life that felt like more than mere survival. Her father had promised her a rose, a simple yet meaningful gift from a world that seemed so far away. It was a symbol of the life they had once known, a life of beauty and privilege. But it was also a symbol of something more, the hope that even in the darkest of times, something beautiful could still bloom. As Laurent prepared for his journey, the weight of his responsibilities pressed down upon him. He had promised his children gifts from the city, but what could he bring them when there was nothing left to give? His older children had made their demands clear: silk shoes, velvet, capes, jewels. They were eager to return to their former lives, to escape the discomfort of their new reality. But Camille, the youngest, had asked for something simple: a rose, something rare and delicate, something to remind her of a world she had never known, but had always longed for. But what Camille didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the journey Laurent was about to take would lead him into a world darker than any of them could have imagined. The storm came without warning. It swept through the forests, tearing through the trees and bending the very earth beneath it. Laurent, his heart heavy with the weight of his loss, pressed onward, his horse struggling against the wind. The city was hours away, yet the storm seemed intent on swallowing him whole. He had no choice but to push forward, hoping for shelter, hoping for some sign that there was still a way out of the abyss. And then, in the midst of the howling wind and the relentless rain, he saw it, a towering stone wall rising out of the darkness, an imposing structure that seemed to beckon him closer, as if it had been waiting for him all along. The gates were slightly ajar, and without a second thought, Laurent urged his horse through them. The mansion that lay beyond was unlike anything he had ever seen. A grand, intimidating structure that loomed like a silent sentinel in the storm. Its windows were dark, and the air was thick with the weight of secrets. Laurent's breath caught in his throat as he stepped forward, unsure of what awaited him. The doors creaked open under his touch, revealing an empty foyer, vast and echoing, with the silence of a place long abandoned. As he stepped inside, he felt it, an invisible presence, watching him, waiting for him to make his next move. The house was alive with its own dark history, each corner holding a story that had never been told. And in that moment, Laurent understood that this place was not just a refuge from the storm. It was something else, something far more dangerous. It was a place where the past and present collided, where the line between reality and myth blurred. He sat down in the grand hall, the weight of his journey settling over him. The food before him was untouched, the fire in the hearth crackling quietly in the background. His mind raced, but no answers came. His thoughts turned back to Camille, to the rose she had asked for, to the life they had once had. And then, without warning, a figure appeared. A man, or something that resembled a man. He was enormous, his face covered with a wild beard, his eyes burning with a fury that seemed to pierce through the very air. His voice, when it came, was a growl, low, guttural, as though it had been forged in the darkness of the world's deepest corners. "You took advantage of my hospitality without asking." The beast growled, his eyes narrowing. "You ate my food, you slept in my chair, and now you have taken every bloom from my prized rose bush." Laurent froze. He had no words, no defense. The beast was right, but he had not come here to steal. He had come here to survive, to find something, anything, to make things right again. And yet, in this strange and terrible place, he found himself bound by a new set of rules. Ones he could not understand. "I demand you make it right," the beast continued. "You will work off your debt here, or someone from your family must take your place." Laurent's heart sank. He had nothing to offer, no way to pay this price. And as the darkness closed in, Laurent realized that his journey had only just begun. The road ahead would lead him to a place of unimaginable mystery, where the line between beast and man, love and hatred, would be tested in ways he never could have anticipated. But one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The merchant's return. The wind had calmed, and the storm's fury had settled into a distant murmur. But the silence that lingered over the cottage was thick with anticipation. Laurent, weary from his journey, had returned home with news that shook the very foundation of their world. One of his lost ships had reappeared in the port, its cargo largely intact, the small flicker of hope that had been extinguished for so long, now reignited with a breath of life. The older children were the first to hear the news. As the words slipped from their father's lips, their faces lit up like candles in the dark, igniting the air with excitement. The world they had known, their silken dresses, their fine furniture, their carefully curated lives, seemed within reach once more. No longer would they be shackled to the dust of a small cottage, nor the humble tasks of baking bread or scrubbing floors. The city, with its promises of glamour and indulgence, was calling them back. For the first time in years, they could taste the sweetness of that life again. They spoke of fine jewels, extravagant feasts, and of returning to the comforts they had so foolishly squandered. But amidst their jubilant chatter, one voice remained quiet. Camille. She sat in the corner, her gaze turned inward as her siblings' voices rose around her in a crescendo of excitement. She had never been one for grandiose dreams, and the prospect of returning to the life they had once known filled her with a hollow ache. She had become used to the simplicity of their new existence. The small cottage nestled on the edge of the town had become her sanctuary, a place where the air smelled of freshly baked bread and the earth was alive with the vibrant greens of her garden. The hours spent learning the ways of the village, with the soil beneath her fingers and the warmth of the sun on her face, had given her a sense of purpose she had never known before. The thought of abandoning this life, of leaving behind the steady rhythm of her days, seemed unfathomable to her now. There was something profoundly comforting in the routine of it all. The quiet stillness of their home, the laughter of the children as they worked together, the sense of community that had slowly woven its way into their lives. It was a world far removed from the hollow indulgence of their former existence. But there was also the weight of her family's expectations pressing down upon her. Laurent had struggled for so long, and now the chance to restore their fortunes was within his grasp. He had asked each of them for a request, a token to mark their return to wealth. Her siblings had demanded silk, velvet, jewels, things that would fill the empty spaces left by years of loss. Camille, however, had asked for only one thing, a single rose, a simple token of beauty, something to remind her of the world she had once longed for, but never truly known. Now, with that world within reach, Camille found herself caught between the life she had come to cherish and the duty she felt to her family. How could she possibly explain to them that she no longer desired to return to the life of luxury they once had? How could she tell them that the things they so eagerly sought, riches, fine clothes, idle pleasures, held no true meaning for her anymore? Her father, Laurent, had returned to them with a heavy heart, burdened by the weight of the decision before him. He had promised his children that the city would offer them the gifts they had so longed for. But he knew that there would be no returning to the old life without sacrifices. And now, as the family's fortunes shifted once more, Laurent was torn between the promise of wealth and the quiet, steadfast love of his youngest daughter. Camille rose from her seat, her eyes flicking to her father. She could see the weariness in his face, the exhaustion that had settled into his bones after years of struggling to make ends meet. She had known for so long the burden he carried, but this newfound hope seemed to weigh heavier than anything that had come before. Her heart clenched as she watched him, standing before his children, eager to restore the family's pride, to reclaim the life they had lost. He looked at her with that quiet understanding in his eyes, as if he knew the struggle brewing within her. But still, he said nothing. The silence between them spoke volumes. The older children, filled with their dreams of silk gowns and grand estates, were oblivious to Camille's inner turmoil. They had never understood her, never seen the beauty she found in the simple things. To them, life was a game of appearances, a never-ending chase for the next indulgence. But Camille had grown tired of that chase. She had come to love the rhythm of hard work, the joy of contributing to something that felt real. The thought of returning to a life where everything was dictated by wealth and status felt suffocating. The evening passed in a haze of excitement. Camille couldn't join in their discussions about the grand gifts they would receive. Their words, filled with the thrill of impending luxury, sounded distant like the echo of a dream she no longer wished to follow. She had become someone else, someone whose desires had shifted in ways she hadn't even expected. That night, as the family settled into their beds, Camille found herself wide awake, staring at the ceiling. The house around her was silent, but her mind was filled with questions. How could she abandon this life she had come to love? How could she leave behind the comfort of the cottage, the peacefulness of her simple routine? And yet, how could she deny her family the chance to reclaim their fortune, to restore their dignity? The pull of her family's needs was strong, but the pull of her heart, of the life she had come to cherish, was stronger still. And as the night stretched on, Camille made a decision. She would not return to the life of wealth and idle luxury. Instead, she would remain in this quiet corner of the world where she had found meaning, purpose, and peace. She would stay with the family she had worked so hard to rebuild, even if it meant facing the disapproval of her siblings and her father's silent disappointment. In the end, Camille knew that her choice would not be an easy one, but sometimes the hardest paths were the ones that led to the most profound transformations, and she was ready to embrace her own, no matter where it took her. A journey to the city. The morning Laurent was set to depart was heavy with an unspoken tension. The promise of restoring the family's former wealth had brought with it a glimmer of hope. But beneath that optimism, there was a quiet sense of fear. Fear of what they had lost and the uncertainty of what was to come. It lingered in the air, palpable and thick, as Laurent packed his saddlebag and prepared to embark on the long journey to the port city. The children were buzzing with excitement, their voices rising in a chorus of demands. The older siblings, those who had once reveled in the opulence of their father's wealth, now longed for its return. Each one voiced their desires: silk shoes with glittering buckles, velvet capes, elaborate hats adorned with fine feathers, and jewels that sparkled like distant stars. Their voices were sharp, their words laden with expectations, as if the gifts they hoped for could erase the hardships of the past years, could return them to the lives they had lost so carelessly. But Camille, standing quietly at the back of the room, felt none of the same fervor. Her siblings' wishes felt distant, hollow. They were consumed with the idea of return, with the idea of reclaiming what they had once had. But Camille had no such desires. She had learned over the course of the past 2 years to find beauty in simplicity, to value the small, quiet moments that had defined her new life. When her father turned to her, his tired eyes searching for her request, Camille hesitated. She had never been one for lavish desires, never been one to ask for things she didn't need. Her heart wasn't drawn to jewels or fine clothes, not like her older siblings. She had come to cherish the simplicity of their cottage life, the warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth, the joy of working side by side with her family. But there was one thing, one simple thing that had lingered in her heart. A rose, just one. The sight of a rose had been a distant dream for Camille, something she had read about in books or heard of from travelers, but never seen for herself. They did not grow in the region, and they were too rare, too costly. Yet, the image of a single rose, a symbol of beauty, of something fragile and pure, had captured her imagination. It was not the extravagance of wealth she longed for, but the quiet elegance of nature's simple gift. "Father," she said softly. her voice barely rising above the noise of her siblings. "I only wish for a rose, just one. Any color would be lovely." The room fell momentarily silent. Her siblings paused, glancing at one another with expressions that bordered on amusement. A rose. It was such a small request, such a trivial thing in the grand scheme of the wealth they hoped for. But Camille, in her quiet way, had always been different. She had never been driven by the same desires that consumed them. While they sought the external validation of wealth and grandeur, Camille found solace in the inner peace she had discovered in their new life. Laurent, though, saw something in her request that the others did not. He saw a quiet yearning for beauty, for something that transcended the material, something that had remained untouched by the hardships they had endured. A rose. It was a simple request, but in it he saw the depth of Camille's soul. He saw her longing for something pure, something to remind her of the world she had once dreamed of, a world she could never fully grasp. A soft smile tugged at his lips as he nodded to his youngest daughter. "I will bring you a rose, Camille," he promised, his voice thick with emotion. "A rose, just for you." It was a promise that felt too small to hold the weight of what they had lost, and yet it held within it the seed of something far more meaningful. Camille's heart fluttered at his words, not because it was a grand gesture, but because it was something pure, something that felt untouched by the chaos around them. In that one promise, she felt seen, as if her quiet desires had finally found a place in the world. As Laurent mounted his horse and prepared to leave, Camille watched him with a mixture of emotions. Love for the father who had always provided for them, a deep sadness that they were once again caught in the whirlwind of their past, and a quiet sense of longing for the life she had come to love. She knew that her father's journey would be filled with uncertainty, with the same trials that had weighed him down in the past. The promise of a rose, while small, was a thread of hope she clung to, a reminder that not everything had to be lost to the pursuit of wealth. Her siblings, eager for their own spoils, seemed to hardly notice her departure, their minds already lost in fantasies of silken gowns and glittering jewels. But Camille's heart was elsewhere, tied to the small, humble life they had built. As Laurent disappeared down the path, she stood at the door, her fingers gently brushing the cool wood of the frame, and silently made a vow. No matter what riches might come from the city, no matter how the family's fortune might shift, she would not return to the life they had once known. She had found something more valuable than gold in the quiet days of their cottage, something that no amount of silk or jewels could replace. Her journey, too, was a path of transformation, a journey towards something simpler, something more meaningful, and in that, Camille found a kind of strength that had been growing within her all along. As her father's figure faded into the distance, Camille's heart beat with a quiet resolve. The rose was a symbol, but it was also a promise to herself, to the life she had chosen, and to the family she loved. Her world, as small and humble as it was enough, and it would always be enough. The storm and the beast's mansion, the sky had darkened by the time Laurent left the familiar comforts of the village behind. His journey to the city was supposed to be one of relief, an opportunity to reclaim what had been lost, to begin anew. But instead the road had grown treacherous. The once calm air had shifted, and a storm rolled in swiftly from the horizon, as if the world itself had conspired to stand in his way. Raindrops slammed against Laurent's face like cold, sharp needles, the wind howling through the trees with a force that seemed to tear at his very soul. His horse, unsettled by the fierce gusts, began to panic, veering off course and plunging into the dense forest surrounding the road. Laurent had no choice but to hold on tightly as the beast bucked and kicked, fighting against the wind that seemed to guide them deeper into the unknown. Hours passed, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. The sky grew darker, the night swallowing any hint of light. Laurent's thoughts were clouded with worry, both for his lost way and the uncertainty of the road ahead. He had never imagined such a violent tempest. The world felt utterly alien, and each gust of wind seemed to draw him further away from the life he had once known. The landscape now seemed unfamiliar, threatening, and filled with an unsettling emptiness. As the storm raged on, Laurent's heart pounded. His only thought was to find shelter. The horse's hooves beat against the uneven ground, each step more frantic than the last. Through the sheets of rain, Laurent's eyes caught a flicker of movement ahead, a shape rising out of the mist like a shadow in the night, a tall stone wall, a gate, a mansion looming, its silhouette barely visible through the heavy storm. Hope surged through Laurent's veins as he spurred the horse forward, desperate for refuge from the storm. He could feel his strength waning, his limbs aching from the long journey and the brutal weather. The mansion, though dark and imposing, was the only sign of life in this forsaken wilderness. It stood as a fortress against the storm, offering the possibility of warmth and safety. But as Laurent drew closer, the mansion's grandeur only heightened his unease. The walls were tall and foreboding, and the iron gate that stood ajar seemed to beckon him like a warning, an invitation that felt far more like a command. Still, in his exhaustion and desperation, Laurent dismounted and pushed open the heavy gate. It creaked loudly, the sound reverberating through the air like a warning cry. He led his horse up the gravel path, the mansion growing larger and more menacing with each step. The wind howled through the trees, the branches thrashing violently in the storm's grip. Laurent felt the weight of the mansion's silence press down on him, its windows dark, its imposing structure more a prison than a place of refuge. Yet there was no turning back. The rain soaked him to the bone, and the cold gnawed at his bones with an unrelenting chill. Reaching the massive front door, Laurent hesitated. It was a beautiful door, carved with intricate designs, its wood dark and polished, but it seemed to exude an eerie stillness, as though it had not been opened in years. Without another thought, Laurent lifted the heavy iron knocker and let it fall. The sound echoed loud and hollow through the mansion's empty halls. There was no answer. Laurent's heart quickened, but the storm was upon him now, and the chill from the rain had seeped into his very bones. He pushed against the door, and with surprising ease, it swung inward. The grand entranceway revealed itself before him, a space vast and imposing, like the mouth of a cavern, dark and silent as if the mansion itself were holding its breath. He stepped inside, his boots clicking on the cold flagstones. The door slammed shut behind him, and for a moment, Laurent simply stood in the silence, listening to the storm rage outside. The wind howled, the rain pounded, but inside there was only an unnatural quiet. The air was thick with dust, the scent of neglect hanging heavy in the room. The hearth was cold, the once glorious tapestries now faded and torn, their colors muted by the years. The space, though grand, felt abandoned, as though time itself had left it behind. Laurent's exhaustion weighed heavily on him. His stomach growled with hunger, and his limbs trembled with fatigue. The mansion seemed to offer no answers, no warmth, no sense of safety. Yet as he ventured deeper into the eerie stillness, he saw it, a table set for one, a simple meal of bread, roasted meat, and a glass of wine sat untouched, as though waiting for someone to partake. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to turn and flee the mansion and its unsettling silence. But hunger gnawed at him, and exhaustion clouded his judgment. The temptation of food was too great. Without another thought, Laurent seated himself at the table and began to eat. The bread was stale, the meat cold, but the wine was rich, its warmth spreading through him like fire. It wasn't the feast he had once known, but it was sustenance, and for a moment it dulled the discomfort that had plagued him. Laurent ate in silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire in the hearth and the occasional creak of the house settling. No one came to claim the meal. No footsteps echoed in the halls. He finished the meal, his stomach full, but the unease that lingered in the mansion's shadows remained. The silence was deafening, and the walls seemed to close in on him, as if they were watching, waiting. Exhausted and unable to resist any longer, Laurent sank into the armchair near the hearth, the warmth of the fire coaxing him into a deep, dreamless sleep. But as he closed his eyes, the unease did not fade. Instead, it seemed to grow, like the shadow of something lurking just beyond his reach. The mansion, with its towering walls and silent halls, held its secrets close. Laurent had found shelter, yes, but the price of that shelter had yet to be paid. The confrontation. Laurent awoke with a start, his mind foggy from a deep, unsettling sleep. The fire had long since died down, leaving only the cold remnants of warmth that had once provided comfort. The flickering light of dawn barely penetrated the thick curtains of the mansion's grand hall, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. For a moment, he was disoriented, unsure of where he was. The storm had passed, but the tension in the air was far from gone. His eyes adjusted to the dimness of the room, and he slowly sat up, rubbing his face. His body felt heavy, his limbs sluggish, as though the weight of the night's events had settled into his bones. The events of the previous evening, the eerie mansion, the unsettling meal, the haunting silence, flooded back into his mind like a rising tide. Then the door to the grand hall creaked open. Laurent's heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the sound, a chill running down his spine. In the doorway stood the owner of the mansion, the figure he had only glimpsed in passing the night before. But now, the creature before him was fully revealed, and the sight sent a shiver through Laurent's entire being. The beast stood tall, imposing, a hulking figure cloaked in shadow. His presence filled the room, suffocating the air with a mixture of anger and something darker, something ancient. His features were grotesque, twisted, monstrous. Thick, unruly facial hair framed a face too harsh for any man, and his eyes glowed with an unnerving intensity. He was unlike anything Laurent had ever seen, his very existence seeming to defy nature. The beast's gaze locked onto Laurent with a seething ferocity. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Before the beast spoke, his voice was deep, guttural, and tinged with the weight of centuries of pain. "You," he growled, his words like thunder. "You have stolen from me." Laurent froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do you mean?" he stammered, his voice unsteady, unsure of the gravity of the situation. The beast's eyes narrowed, his gaze narrowing like a predator sizing up its prey. He stepped forward, each movement exuding a menacing power. With a sweep of his large, calloused hand, he gestured toward the empty space beside him. Laurent followed the gesture, his stomach twisting into a knot as he saw the remains of the rose bush, the very one he had taken from the night before. The beast's voice came again, low and dangerous. "My roses," he hissed. "You have taken every bloom from my prized bush. You have taken what I hold most dear." Laurent swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had been so caught up in his hunger and desperation, he hadn't thought about the roses. His mind raced for an excuse, a way to explain himself, but the weight of the beast's presence crushed any hope of reasoning. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The beast's massive frame loomed over Laurent, his anger radiating in waves, suffocating him. "You took advantage of my hospitality," he growled, his voice echoing through the cold hall. "You ate my food, slept in my chair, and now you have taken from me that which can never be replaced." Laurent's pulse raced. He swallowed again, his mind desperate for an answer, for a way out. But the beast's glare burned into him, silencing any protest he could muster. "I am not a man who forgives easily," the beast continued, stepping closer until Laurent could feel the oppressive weight of his presence, like a storm pressing in on him. "You will repay me for your theft. You will work for me, and you will work until I deem my debt paid in full." Laurent's knees trembled beneath him, his mind whirling with disbelief. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing against his chest with an almost physical force. His mind raced, seeking any escape, but the reality of his situation slammed into him like a tidal wave. There was no way out. "You will work off your debt," the beast repeated, his voice sharp and unforgiving, "or you will send someone to take your place." Laurent's heart sank. The weight of the decision pressed on him like a vice, crushing any hope he might have had. He glanced around the room, seeking some comfort, some reassurance that this was all just a bad dream. But the cold, dark stone walls offered no solace, only silence and the shadow of the beast looming over him. "I have nothing," Laurent whispered, his voice barely audible. "I cannot pay you. I have no means to repay you." The beast's eyes glowed brighter, his fury intensifying. "Then someone must take your place," he declared, his voice booming like the growl of a wild animal. "If you cannot pay, someone else must bear the burden of your crime." Laurent's mind reeled. His family, his children. What could he say? What could he do? The thought of sending one of them in his stead felt like an impossible choice. How could he burden his children with this? How could he ask them to suffer for his mistakes? "I cannot," Laurent said, his voice thick with helplessness. "I cannot ask them to take my place." The beast's lips curled into something resembling a smile. though it was more a snarl than any expression of kindness. "Then you have no choice but to stay and work for me," he said, the words like a death sentence. "And you will work until your debt is paid in full." Laurent's heart sank even further, his body heavy with dread. He had no other option. He was powerless, trapped in this mansion, with this monstrous figure, with no way out. And so he nodded, defeated. As the weight of the beast's demand crushed him, the darkness that surrounded the mansion seemed to grow deeper, the shadows longer, as Laurent realized that his fate, and perhaps the fate of his family, was now inextricably linked to this terrifying place. The beast stepped back, his eyes never leaving Laurent. "Prepare yourself," he said, his voice low and foreboding. "You will begin your work soon. And remember, there is no escape." Laurent's body trembled as the beast turned and strode away, leaving him alone in the cold, oppressive silence of the mansion. The words echoed in Laurent's mind, the dread settling like a heavy fog. There was no escape. Camille's decision. The night was quiet, save for the soft rustling of the wind outside, carrying with it the faint scent of autumn. Laurent had just returned from the dreadful encounter at the mansion, his body weighed down not just by the burden of his debts, but by the overwhelming knowledge that his failure had now fallen upon his family. As he sat in the dimly lit cottage, his weary eyes scanning the faces of his children, there was a heaviness in the air, a weight none of them could escape. The older children, as they gathered around the kitchen table, were impatiently waiting for the gifts Laurent had promised them. It had been a long journey, and their expectations had grown as large as their demands. The extravagant requests for silken shoes, velvet capes, and sparkling jewels filled the air, their voices rising in playful excitement. They seemed more preoccupied with the idea of returning to the life they had once known, one of luxury, indulgence, and idleness, than with their father's weary demeanor, his body stiff with the wear of both physical and emotional exhaustion. Laurent felt his heart sink further with each passing moment, the weight of his failure pressing deeper into his chest. The very children he had fought for, the ones whose smiles had once been his greatest joy, now seemed distant, detached from the harsh reality of their situation. The cruel irony of it all struck him sharply. The life of comfort they so craved had been taken from them by his own poor decisions. Yet none of them, save for Camille, seemed to grasp the magnitude of what had transpired. He could feel his throat tightening as he prepared to speak. It had been hard enough to admit his failures to himself, but now he was forced to tell his children the truth. There would be no silken dresses or elaborate gifts this time. There was only the heavy reality of his promises unfulfilled, of the crushing burden he had been forced to accept. "I'm sorry," Laurent began, his voice hoarse, almost breaking under the weight of the words. His gaze fell to the table, unable to meet the expectant eyes of his children. "I was unable to reclaim our fortune. The ship, the one I thought would restore us, it was taken by creditors. And now," his voice faltered as the memory of the beast's words returned to him with brutal clarity. "Now, I must return to the mansion to work off the debt I owe." The room fell silent. The older children exchanged glances, their faces unreadable, their eyes flickering with the slightest flicker of disinterest. It wasn't surprise or sorrow in their expressions. It was indifference. Camille, standing by the door, felt her heart constrict in her chest. Her brothers and sisters, the ones she had once adored, had already accepted the idea of returning to their lives of comfort without a second thought. They were unmoved by the news, as if their own father's suffering was just another inconvenient disruption in their pursuit of material indulgence. Laurent's heart sank as he looked into the faces of his older children, their selfishness like a cold wind cutting through him. They had heard the same news, but it seemed to have no impact on them. They could only think of the lavish gifts they would receive, the world they would return to. In their eyes, his predicament was a triviality, a burden that could be brushed off in exchange for the fleeting pleasures they so desperately craved. But then, there was Camille. She had been silent throughout her father's confession, her eyes fixed on him with an unreadable expression, unlike her siblings. She had not clamored for riches or extravagance. There was no gleam of selfish desire in her gaze. Instead, Camille's heart had been pierced by the quiet agony of her father's words. Her mind raced, the weight of the decision she would have to make pressing against her chest. With a soft sigh, she stepped forward, breaking the silence that had lingered in the room like a thick fog. Her eyes met her father's, filled with a quiet resolve, a fire burning within them that contrasted sharply with the gloom surrounding them. "I will go," Camille said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Laurent's eyes widened in disbelief, his tired face crumbling with a mixture of guilt and sorrow. "Camille, no," he protested weakly. "You can't. You shouldn't have to bear this burden." But Camille was unwavering. Her expression softened as she knelt before her father, her hands reaching out to grasp his. "Father," she said softly, her voice a balm for his broken spirit, "you have done everything for us. I will not let you go alone. If someone must bear this burden, let it be me. I can help. I will work to repay the debt. I will go in your place." Laurent's heart tightened at her words. It was an act of such selflessness, such quiet bravery, that it took him by surprise. His daughter, the youngest of his children, the one who had cared for the cottage and its humble surroundings, was willing to sacrifice her own life, her own future, for the sake of the family. "Camille, this is not a life for you," he protested, his voice trembling with the weight of his emotions. "You deserve more than this. You deserve a future, a life free from the shadows of our mistakes. Please, don't throw your life away for me." But Camille simply shook her head, her eyes shining with quiet determination. "Father, I am the only one who can do this. You cannot ask anyone else to take your place. I will not let you go alone to face the consequences of this curse." She stood, her eyes never leaving his. "It is my duty to my family, to you." Laurent gazed at his daughter, his heart breaking with love and pride. She had grown into a woman of such strength, such grace, qualities that he had never imagined she would possess. The thought of sending her to that mansion to face the beast and his cruel demands was unthinkable. But Camille's resolve was unshakable. She would go, not for herself, but for the family she loved. With a trembling hand, Laurent reached out and pulled her into an embrace, his arms shaking as he held her close, the simple, fragile rose that Camille had asked for so many months ago, now pressed between them, a symbol of her promise, remained in her hands. It was a small thing, a mere flower, but it had come to represent so much more. A symbol of sacrifice, a promise to her father that she would not let him bear this burden alone. "I will go," Camille whispered again, her voice soft yet filled with the unyielding strength of her decision. "I promise, Father, I will make you proud." And with that, Camille began to prepare for the journey. She carefully pressed the rose into a book, its delicate petals a reminder of her promise to her father, of the family she loved, and of the sacrifice she was willing to make. She had given her word, and she would not break it, not for anything. As the evening drew to a close and her preparations continued, Camille's heart swelled with both fear and hope. She was uncertain of what lay ahead, but one thing was clear. Her love for her family would guide her, and no sacrifice would be too great if it meant saving them from the fate they now faced. She would face the beast, face the mansion's dark and mysterious curse, and she would do so with the strength only a daughter could have. Her journey was about to begin. The journey to the mansion. The morning of Camille's departure arrived with an unsettling clarity. The sun barely broke through the heavy clouds that hung low over the village, casting a muted light across the earth, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The air was crisp with the remnants of autumn, and the winds carried the promise of winter's encroachment. As she stood at the threshold of her family's cottage, Camille glanced at her father one last time, the weight of the moment sinking in her chest. Laurent, though outwardly composed, had a look in his eyes that betrayed his anxiety. He had already lost so much: his business, his fortune, and now his youngest daughter. Yet he could do nothing to stop her. Camille was resolute. The decision had been made, and now there was no turning back. Their journey began in the quiet hours of the morning, the roads leading them further away from the village and into the rolling hills that stretched toward the distant mansion. The rhythmic sound of the horses' hooves on the dirt path was the only companion to their thoughts, and Camille found herself reflecting on the life she had known. The simple days spent baking bread, tending to the garden, and finding joy in the quiet hum of life. All of that now felt like another lifetime, a world apart from the looming darkness ahead. As they traveled, Laurent kept mostly to himself, his brow furrowed as he thought of the curse his daughter was about to face. Every step he took was a reminder of his failure, of how he had brought this upon his family. Yet Camille, though nervous, remained calm. She had chosen this path with a deep sense of responsibility, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she was sacrificing her own future for the good of the family. And while fear gnawed at her insides, she did not let it show. There was no turning back now. The journey, though long, was uneventful. The landscape began to shift as they neared the Chateau mansion, the hills giving way to a dense forest of twisted trees, their branches bare and clawing at the gray sky like the hands of ghosts. The wind picked up, sweeping through the canopy, whispering through the empty woods. The silence of the forest was unnerving, as if it, too, was waiting for something. It was in this eerie quiet that the mansion finally came into view. The trees parted as though bowing before the towering structure, its grandeur rising out of the mist like a forgotten relic of a past time. Camille's breath caught in her throat as she looked up at it. A massive estate, its stone walls dark and weathered, standing against the bleak sky like a monolith to forgotten power. It seemed as though it had been there forever, a sentinel that had watched over the land, untouched by time. The mansion's sheer size was overwhelming. Its architecture was both grand and imposing, with the towering spires that pierced the sky and windows that seemed to gaze down upon them with cold, watchful eyes. The very air around it seemed heavy, thick with the weight of secrets and long-forgotten history. Camille felt a shiver creep down her spine as they approached, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to steel herself, but the mansion's looming presence filled her with dread. As they passed through the iron gates, Camille's gaze was drawn to the garden before the mansion, an overgrown rose garden that seemed to bloom in defiance of the looming darkness that surrounded it. The roses were vibrant, their petals tinged with an otherworldly glow, as though they had a life of their own. Camille's hand instinctively reached for the rose her father had given her, the simple flower now a symbol of all the promises she had made. She pressed it to her chest, its soft fragrance offering a strange comfort in the face of her growing unease. The garden was beautiful, yet it seemed strangely unwelcoming. The roses stood tall and proud, their petals curled in perfection, but there was something unsettling about them. The air was thick with the scent of flowers, yet it did nothing to soothe her. It felt as if the garden itself held a dark secret, its beauty a mask for something far more sinister beneath. Camille shivered again, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Laurent, noticing her discomfort, slowed the horse, his own gaze scanning the mansion with suspicion. "We must be careful," he muttered under his breath, as if the mansion could hear them. "There's something unnatural about this place." Camille nodded silently, but her thoughts were already racing ahead. What had her father gotten them into? Who was this beast, this mysterious figure, who had so easily trapped them in his web? And more importantly, what was he waiting for from her? Her heart fluttered with a mixture of fear and curiosity, but she tried to suppress it. She would not be shaken, at least not outwardly. As they drew closer to the front steps of the mansion, Camille could not help but feel a profound sense of awe. The front door stood before them, massive and carved from dark oak, its surface marred by time. The knocker was shaped like a snarling lion, its eyes glinting in the faint light that filtered through the clouds. It seemed alive, almost as if it could strike at any moment. Camille's hand tightened around the reins, and she felt a tremor in her chest as she looked up at the door. Laurent dismounted first, and Camille followed suit, her legs unsteady beneath her. The mansion seemed to swallow them whole as they ascended the steps, the grandeur of the entrance now fully enveloping them. There was no turning back now. They were here, standing at the edge of the unknown, about to face whatever lay beyond the doors. As they reached the door, Laurent reached for the knocker, but before his hand could touch it, the door creaked open, as if waiting for them. No one was there to greet them, no servant or guide to show them inside. Camille's pulse quickened as they stepped over the threshold, entering the mansion's vast, dimly lit interior. Inside, the mansion was every bit as imposing as it was on the outside. The ceilings stretched high above them. The air was thick with dust, the heavy scent of age and neglect clinging to the stone walls. The grand staircase rose before them, its steps dark and worn. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of their footsteps as they echoed through the empty hall. The sense of mystery deepened with every step they took, as though she had entered another world, a world of secrets, a place where the passage of time held no sway. Every corner seemed to hide something. Every shadow seemed to whisper a forgotten story. And then, as they walked deeper into the mansion, Camille could not shake the feeling that they were being watched. She turned, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. But the hallway was empty, save for the countless portraits that lined the walls. Their eyes followed her as she passed, and she felt the chill of their gaze on her skin. Camille's heart raced, and as they moved deeper into the mansion, she wondered just how much of the mystery here was real, and how much was a part of the curse that awaited her. Would she find answers within these walls, or would the mansion reveal even darker secrets she could never have imagined? Entering the beast's world. As the heavy wooden door of the mansion closed behind them, Camille felt a shiver run down her spine. The silence was immediate and profound, swallowing them whole, and yet the vastness of the mansion seemed to beckon her forward, as though it was a world unto itself. It was as if time had paused within these walls, leaving only shadows and whispers to fill the empty spaces. Laurent stepped forward, his face drawn with worry, his hands trembling as he adjusted the bag that held the few possessions Camille had brought along. The moment had arrived. Camille could feel her heart pounding in her chest, its rhythm loud in the stillness of the mansion. The mystery of the place was suffocating, and with every step deeper into the cavernous space, she felt a growing sense of both wonder and unease. Before she could take another step, the sound of soft footsteps echoed down the hallway. Camille turned, startled, her breath catching in her throat. A boy, perhaps no older than 12, appeared at the top of the stairs, his clothes plain but neat. His face was innocent, yet his eyes held an unreadable depth, like they had seen far more than one might expect of someone so young. He regarded them silently, and then, without speaking a word, he beckoned them forward. Laurent hesitated, glancing at Camille with a look of silent concern. Camille, however, felt an odd sense of calm wash over her. There was something about the boy, his presence, that seemed almost welcoming, as if he were a small thread that could unravel the mystery of the mansion. She nodded slightly to her father, signaling that she was ready to follow the boy. Without a word, the boy turned and began to ascend the staircase, his steps light and sure. Camille followed him, her eyes taking in the grandeur of the mansion. The walls were lined with tapestries, their rich colors muted by years of dust. The ceilings soared above them, painted with intricate scenes of battles and kings long forgotten, their stories lost to time. Everywhere she looked, there was something new to discover, something grand yet forlorn, as if the mansion itself were a faded reflection of a once glorious past. The boy led them to a corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly before them. Camille's footsteps echoed in the vastness, amplifying the unease that had settled in her chest. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the soft shuffle of her own feet and the boy's purposeful stride. Finally, he stopped in front of a door at the end of the hall. He turned to Camille, his expression unchanged, and pushed the door open with a creak that seemed to reverberate through the stillness. Inside, Camille was taken aback. The room was nothing like what she had expected. Instead of the humble servant's quarters she had braced herself for, she found herself staring into a bedroom that could rival a queen's chamber. The bed was large, draped in dark velvet curtains that caught the light of the flickering candle. Sconces. The furniture was elegant yet imposing, with rich wood trim and intricately carved details. A large, ornate mirror stood against one wall, reflecting the room in its glassy surface. Camille felt as though she had stepped into a different world, one that was both captivating and alien. It was a place of opulence, a far cry from the simplicity of the cottage she had left behind. Her breath caught in her throat as she took in the room's beauty. Everything was perfect, yet there was something unsettling about it. The room, like the mansion itself, seemed frozen in time, untouched by the passage of years. The air was heavy with the scent of aged wood and faint traces of perfume, as if someone or something had once lived here, but now it was all but abandoned. The silence in the room felt oppressive, as though the walls themselves were waiting for something. The boy gestured for her to enter, his eyes still unreadable. Camille stepped inside, her movements hesitant. Laurent lingered in the doorway for a moment, then turned away, no doubt reluctant to leave his daughter in this strange and foreboding place. "I will see to the arrangements," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Do not worry, Camille. I will return soon." Camille nodded, trying to give him a reassuring smile, though her heart was heavy with uncertainty. As her father left the room, the door creaked shut behind him, and she was left alone in the cavernous silence. Her pulse quickened, and the weight of the mansion's enormity pressed down on her shoulders. It was as though she were the only living soul in a place long forgotten, a relic of a forgotten era. The boy had vanished as quietly as he had come, leaving Camille to contemplate her surroundings. She turned slowly, her gaze wandering around the room once more. The opulence that surrounded her seemed to mock her. She had been thrust into a life she never could have imagined, a life far removed from the simplicity she had known. The mansion's beauty was undeniable, but it was tinged with a dark undercurrent, an unspoken presence that hovered just beneath the surface. Camille moved toward the window, drawn by the soft, golden light filtering through the heavy curtains. She pulled them aside, revealing the view of the sprawling garden below. The rose bushes from earlier filled the courtyard, their petals glowing softly in the light of the setting sun. They were as beautiful as they were haunting, their presence a reminder of the promise she had made to her father. She pressed her hand to the glass, her breath fogging up the cold surface. As she gazed out into the fading light, her thoughts swirled in a whirlwind of confusion and fear. What had she gotten herself into? What was this place, and who was the beast who ruled it? The questions gnawed at her, but there were no answers, only the eerie silence of the mansion that seemed to echo through every corner of her mind. As she turned back to the room, Camille's heart pounded with an uneasy mixture of curiosity and dread. She had no idea what awaited her in this strange world, but one thing was certain. She had crossed a threshold into a realm of darkness, a place where the lines between reality and the fantastical blurred into something she could never have prepared for. The beast's world had claimed her, and there was no turning back now. The Baron's secret, the mansion, was quieter than Camille had ever imagined a house could be. It was a strange kind of quiet, the kind that filled every inch of the space, as though it were a living thing, watching her, waiting for her to unravel its secrets. Her first day as a housekeeper felt like a series of isolated moments, each one pulling her deeper into the mystery of this grand, foreboding place. The kitchen had been easy enough to tidy, though it had been long neglected, dust settling thickly over the countertops and stovetop. Camille worked diligently, clearing away the layers of abandonment, breathing life back into the empty space. But the task of cleaning the vast mansion felt insurmountable. There were so many rooms, so many forgotten corners that seemed to have been untouched for decades. The grand staircases echoed underfoot, the dark wood floors slick with years of dust, the walls adorned with tapestries that had faded long ago. The whole house was a maze, an eerie labyrinth of spaces that seemed to exist in a world of their own. As the day drew on, Camille noticed the absence of the Baron. He had barely shown himself, retreating to his private chambers with nothing more than a brief acknowledgement in passing. She had glimpsed him once, standing at the far end of the hallway, his hulking figure casting a long shadow. His face, still covered in layers of hair, was set in its usual grim expression. But for a fleeting moment, Camille had thought she saw something else. A subtle change, a softening, a glimpse of something more human, hiding beneath the rough exterior. Curiosity stirred in Camille, but she forced herself to focus on the tasks at hand. It was her duty now to keep the mansion in order, to bring back a semblance of life to the place. She had to put her own feelings aside, however conflicted they were, and focus on the work. But as evening fell and the shadows lengthened, Camille found herself once again drawn toward the library. The Baron's library was everything she had imagined it to be. Massive shelves stacked high with volumes that stretched up to the very ceiling. It was a room of immense power and intellect, filled with the weight of centuries of knowledge. Yet as Camille stood in the doorway, watching the Baron pore over a book in his armchair, she felt a strange pull in her chest. There was something about the way he sat alone, lost in his reading, that made him appear less like the monster of legend and more like a man trapped within his own thoughts. For a long moment, Camille simply watched him, unnoticed, as he turned the pages of his book with a concentration that seemed both desperate and deliberate. His sharp, beastly features were softened in the dim light of the fireplace, but the air around him still felt thick with his darkness, as if the shadows were part of his very being. But in that quiet moment, she saw a flicker of something almost vulnerable, something human. She didn't know why she was drawn to him like this. She had been taught to fear him, to see him as a beast, an unnatural creature who had cursed her family's fortune. And yet, as she watched him, Camille couldn't shake the sense that there was more to his story. What had brought him to this point, to this state of solitude? Why did he isolate himself so completely, never seeking companionship, never speaking of his past? He was a man, yes, but he was a man who had become a prisoner of his own curse. Her thoughts were interrupted when the Baron suddenly raised his head, his eyes locking with hers. Camille's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment she froze, unsure of what to do or say. He studied her quietly, his gaze intense, before returning to his book without a word. The silence between them was thick, yet it seemed to carry an unspoken understanding. He wasn't angry, or at least not in the way he usually was. Instead, it was as if he were allowing her to see him, truly see him, without the mask of the beast that he so often wore. Is there something you need? His voice was low, gruff, but there was an undertone to it, a tiredness, a resignation. Camille hesitated before speaking. I was just admiring the library. It's quite impressive. The Baron's lips twitched in something resembling a smile, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. It has been my solace, he muttered, almost to himself. Books are the only companions I have left. There was something profoundly lonely in his words, a vulnerability that seemed at odds with his beastly appearance. Camille felt a pang of sympathy for him, but she quickly suppressed it. She didn't have time for sentimentality. She was here to work, not to sympathize with a man whose curse had brought so much suffering to her family. Still, something about him called to her, a curiosity, a desire to understand the man behind the mask. As she stood there, the heavy silence stretching between them, Camille couldn't shake the feeling that this strange and mysterious man, this beast, was not the monster she had been led to believe. There was more to him than anger, more to him than the curse that had twisted his soul. The Baron seemed to sense her thoughts, for he shifted in his chair, closing the book with a soft thud. He looked at her, his gaze intense, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something, fear maybe, beneath his stern expression. I am not what you think, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I have been cursed, yes, but it is not my nature that is twisted. It is my mistakes, my foolishness, my arrogance. I have spent years trying to atone for them, but the more I search, the more I realize how little I understand. Camille stood frozen, her breath caught in her chest. This was the first time he had spoken of himself like this. The first time he had let her see the person behind the beast. And in that moment, Camille understood. The beast was not born from darkness. It was a result of something far deeper. The curse he bore was not just on his body, but on his very soul. Her heart swelled with empathy for him, and the questions she had harbored about him for so long began to take shape. Who had he been before the curse? What had happened to him to bring him to this lonely, desolate place? She could see now that the beast was not some monstrous figure to be feared, but a man struggling to find redemption, a man bound by a curse he could not escape. As she left the library that evening, Camille's mind raced with thoughts of the Baron's secret, his humanity, and the mysterious past that had led him to this point. She couldn't shake the feeling that her life here in this strange mansion would never be the same again. Something had shifted within her, and she knew that her understanding of the beast, of the man who lived here, was only just beginning. The beast's confession. The mansion was quieter than usual that evening. The air had turned colder, and the sky outside was painted in hues of dark purple, the last light of the sun slowly sinking below the horizon. Camille had spent the day tending to the endless chores of the mansion, and as she moved through the dimly lit hallways, she felt an unusual sense of restlessness. She had become accustomed to the silence of the house, but tonight it felt heavier, more suffocating. It was during her nightly duties that she found herself, once again, drawn to the library. The flickering firelight that escaped from under the door caught her attention, and she hesitated for only a moment before pushing the door open. Inside, the Baron sat in his usual chair by the hearth, a thick book resting on his lap. His face, as always, was half hidden beneath a forest of facial hair. But tonight, there was something different about him. an air of weariness, of burden that seemed to weigh down his broad shoulders. Camille lingered at the threshold, unsure whether to disturb him, but before she could retreat, the Baron glanced up from his book, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "Come in, Camille," he said softly, his voice carrying a note of invitation that felt uncharacteristically gentle. "I've been waiting for you." She stepped inside, the familiar warmth of the fire wrapping around her like a comforting embrace. Camille felt the tension in her chest loosen just slightly, but the unease in the air remained. The Baron gestured for her to sit, and for the first time, there was no authoritative command, no icy distance between them. There was only the quiet, the crackling fire, and the weight of something unspoken hanging in the air. She sat across from him, the space between them filled with a silence that stretched longer than usual. Neither spoke, both seemingly content to sit in the shared stillness. But the weight of the moment pressed down on Camille, urging her to break the silence. It was then that the Baron spoke, his voice low and laden with emotion. "You've probably heard the rumors about me," he began, his voice tinged with an edge of bitterness. "The stories they tell, the curses they whisper. You must think I'm nothing more than a beast, a monster." He paused, his gaze distant, as if looking into a past that still haunted him. Camille sat still, her heart racing. She had heard the rumors, of course. She had heard the whispers from the servants, the frightened villagers who spoke of the Baron in hushed tones. But she had also seen him, had spent time with him in the quiet spaces of this mansion, and now, listening to the vulnerability in his voice, something in her began to shift. "I wasn't always like this," he continued, his voice thick with regret. "Once I was a man, just a man, foolish and vain. I had everything I could ever want, and I took it all for granted. My wealth, my status, my looks. I thought they were everything. I thought they defined me." His words hung in the air, and Camille felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. The Baron's story was not unlike her own family's fall from grace. Once privileged, once adored, and now struggling to make ends meet. She had seen her father's pride, his love for their former life, and the way it had chipped away at him as he faced the reality of their poverty. In many ways, Camille had become like the Baron, hiding her own feelings of helplessness beneath a veneer of practicality. The Baron's voice broke through her thoughts. "I was young and foolish. I never listened to my heart, never cared about the people around me. When I had everything, I thought I could have it all, without consequences." He paused as though gathering the strength to continue. "Then, one day, a woman came to my door. She was poor, ragged, desperate. She begged for food, for shelter. I turned her away. I didn't care for her. I didn't care for anyone but myself." Camille's chest tightened as she listened. She could feel the weight of his words, the sorrow in them, as if the Baron had been carrying this burden for years, perhaps even longer. And as he spoke, she could see it. His remorse, his recognition of the man he had been, and the painful realization that he had been the architect of his own downfall. "The woman cursed me," he said, his voice quiet, almost trembling. "She told me I would be unloved, that I would be cursed by my own vanity, and that I would never find peace until I learned what true humanity was." The room felt stiller now, the fire crackling softly. as if it, too, were listening to the weight of the Baron's confession. Camille's heart ached for him. It was as if she could see the young man he had once been, the one full of life, full of arrogance, and she could almost feel the deep, painful regret that had followed him into the present. I never believed her, the Baron continued, his voice growing more distant. But as the years went on, I began to see the truth in her words. My wealth, my looks, they couldn't save me. They couldn't keep me from loneliness. They couldn't keep me from the isolation I had created for myself. Camille sat frozen, her mind reeling from the weight of the Baron's words. She had seen him as a beast, an angry and bitter man, but now, in this moment of raw honesty, she saw a man who had been torn apart by his own mistakes, by his own pride. He was not just a curse, he was a victim of his own doing. I tried to undo what I had done, he said, his eyes darkened with regret. But it was too late. The curse took hold, and I was left to live this life of solitude. All I wanted was to be free, to be forgiven. But no one could understand, not even myself. Camille could see it now, the torment that had shaped him, the isolation that had driven him into himself, into this dark place. He had lost everything, and in doing so, he had lost the ability to connect with anyone, even himself. The beast he had become wasn't just a physical manifestation. It was the embodiment of years of self-loathing, pride, and regret. I never thought anyone would see me, he said, his voice breaking slightly. But you see me, don't you, Camille? You see past the curse. You see who I am. The words were like a whisper in the quiet room, and Camille felt her heart swell with an overwhelming sense of empathy for him. It was as if, for the first time, she saw the man behind the beast, the broken, sorrowful man who was still fighting to make sense of his existence. Yes, she whispered, her voice soft but steady. I see you. The room fell into silence again, but this time it was a comfortable silence, filled with understanding, with shared pain. Camille knew that the road ahead was uncertain, that she still had so much to learn about the Baron and the curse that bound him. But for the first time since she had arrived at the mansion, she felt a sense of peace. In that moment, Camille realized that the beast's confession wasn't just about his past. It was a turning point for them both. The story of his fall from grace mirrored her own journey in some ways, and it was that shared understanding that began to bind them together. The Baron's curse, it seemed, was not just something to be broken. It was something that could be healed. And Camille was beginning to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, she was the one who could help him find his redemption. Winter's solitude. The first whispers of winter crept into the mansion, long before the first snowflakes began to fall. The once bustling hallways were now eerily silent, save for the occasional sound of Camille's footsteps echoing against the cold stone floors. The mansion, grand as it was, seemed to grow quieter as the days shortened and the winds howled outside. Yet, amid the solitude of the approaching winter, Camille began to find something unexpected, a sense of belonging. The chill in the air mirrored the cold, distant figure she had first encountered in the mansion. The beast, as the villagers called him, was still a figure of mystery and fear. But as the months passed, Camille began to see him differently. Antoine, as he had introduced himself that first night, was not the creature of terror she had once believed. She saw beyond his rugged, almost animalistic appearance, and into the soul that had been hidden for so long. Camille's days had become routine. Her work as a housekeeper, no longer a chore, but a comfort. The kitchen, once cold and disorganized, now buzzed with a life that only Camille could bring. The hearth was always crackling, the scent of fresh bread and simmering stews filling the air. She had found peace in this rhythm, an order that anchored her amidst the vast emptiness of the mansion. And in this order, she found a quiet companionship with Antoine, one that had begun to grow more natural, more profound, with each passing day. In the evenings, after her work was done, Camille would often find herself in the library, where Antoine spent the majority of his time. He would be hunched over a desk, his fingers tracing the pages of an ancient tome, lost in the words. She had grown accustomed to the silence between them, but it was no longer uncomfortable. There was a quiet understanding between them, an unspoken bond that had begun to form, a bond that Camille could feel in the very air around them. It was during one of these nights, as the wind howled outside and the fire flickered in the hearth, that Camille found herself sitting across from Antoine at the library's long table. The soft crackle of the fire was the only sound in the room, and she watched him with a growing sense of curiosity. His face, though still framed by thick facial hair, seemed to soften in the warm glow of the firelight. There was no scowl, no anger in his eyes, only a quiet weariness, a vulnerability that he rarely allowed anyone to see. "I've been thinking about something," Camille said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice felt fragile in the stillness, but Antoine didn't look up from his book. She wasn't sure if he had heard her, but then he lowered the pages and met her gaze. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low and steady, though there was a flicker of interest in his eyes. "I'm curious," Camille continued, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "Do you ever wonder what life would be like if things had been different?" Antoine's gaze softened as he regarded her, his lips pressing into a thin line. He didn't answer right away, but there was something in his eyes that told Camille he understood the question in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. After a long pause, he set the book down gently and leaned back in his chair. "I wonder every day," he confessed quietly, "but I know that I've made my choices, and now I must live with them. The world I once knew is gone. I'm no longer the man I was, and perhaps that's for the better." Camille's heart ached at his words, the sadness that lingered in, his voice pulling her closer to him. She hadn't realized how much she had come to care for him until that moment. He wasn't just the beast. He was a man shaped by regret, by time, by loss. He had suffered in ways she could barely imagine. She swallowed the lump in her throat before speaking again, her words quieter now, as if sharing a secret. I think you've changed more than you realize. I don't see a beast when I look at you. I see a man who's been hurt, who's been lost." The words seemed to hang in the air, and for a moment there was only silence between them. But this silence felt different. It wasn't the oppressive quiet of the mansion. It was something softer, something more tender. Antoine's eyes flickered with emotion, and for the first time in a long while, he looked vulnerable, exposed. "You see me?" he asked, his voice a low whisper. "Even after everything, after all I've done?" Camille nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I do." The sincerity in her voice, the warmth in her eyes, made Antoine's chest tighten with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. It wasn't just gratitude nor pity. It was a recognition, a bond forged in the shared silence of their lives. Camille saw him not for his appearance, not for his past, but for the person he was becoming. "I never thought anyone would see me like that," he admitted softly, his voice barely audible. "I've spent so many years hiding behind this mask, believing I was too far gone for anyone to care." The vulnerability in his voice made Camille's heart ache. She could see it now, the weight of his solitude, the burden of years spent trapped in his own regrets. It wasn't just the physical transformation that had cursed him. It was the emotional distance he had created between himself and the world. "You're not alone," Camille whispered, her voice filled with quiet assurance. "Not anymore." The words felt like a promise, a gentle reassurance that neither of them was truly alone in the vast, empty mansion. And for the first time, Camille felt the possibility of something more, something beyond the walls of the mansion, beyond the curse that had trapped them both. As the wind howled outside and the firelight flickered between them, Camille realized that the mansion, once a place of isolation and fear, had become a place of connection, of understanding. The isolation of winter, the biting cold, had only served to bring them closer. They were both seeking something beyond the curse, beyond the mistakes of their pasts. And together, in the quiet solitude of the mansion, they had found it, a sense of belonging, of understanding, of home. And so, as winter settled around them, Camille and Antoine's companionship deepened. They spent hours in the library reading together, talking late into the night. Their bond, once tentative and fragile, had become a steady thread, woven through the cold, dark days in each other's company. They had found warmth, not just from the fire, but from the shared experience of being misunderstood, of seeking redemption, of learning that even the most cursed among them could find peace. For the first time in years, Antoine allowed himself to believe that perhaps the curse, the darkness that had loomed over him for so long, could finally begin to lift. And Camille, too, found herself believing that in the heart of this cold, lonely mansion, she had finally found her place. The spring awakening, the first breath of spring, was a gentle whisper through the cold, stony walls of the mansion. The earth, once frozen and stiff with winter's grasp, now stirred with new life. The gardens, which had lain dormant for months under the heavy weight of snow, slowly began to stir with vibrant greens and tender petals. The wind, once biting and harsh, had softened, carrying the scent of fresh earth and blossoms. It was as if the mansion itself had come alive once again, stretching awake from its long winter slumber. Camille stood at one of the tall windows, her gaze fixed on the courtyard below, where the first flowers of spring had begun to bloom. She had been working in the mansion for what felt like months now, but time seemed to blur in the quiet, isolated world she had found herself in. The house had grown familiar to her, its dark corners, its long, echoing halls, and most of all, its library, where she had spent countless hours lost in conversation with the Baron. Her relationship with him had transformed in ways she hadn't anticipated. Antoine, the man she had once feared, had become someone she respected, someone she had come to admire for his intellect, his kindness, and more recently, for the way he had begun to open up to her. In the past months, his walls had cracked ever so slightly, and she had seen him not as a beast, but as a man who had once been consumed by vanity, now seeking solace in the quietude of his library, finding redemption in the pages of the books he loved. But today, as Camille stood by the window, watching the garden's awakening, she felt a pull at her heart, a tug of duty that she could not ignore. The letter from her father, which had arrived just that morning, weighed heavily in her hands. It was a simple request, a plea for her return for her sister's wedding. The words seemed so simple, so ordinary, yet they carried with them a flood of emotions that swirled in her chest. Her family had moved on from the fall of their fortune, and her older sister's marriage was a clear sign of that. It was an event she couldn't miss, a responsibility she could not abandon. But her heart was torn in two. The world she had left behind seemed so distant, so small now, compared to the vast, strange world she had built in the mansion. The thought of returning to the cottage, to the life of idleness and emptiness that had once defined her family, left a bitter taste in her mouth. She had grown so accustomed to the quiet beauty of the chateau, the stillness of the library, the warmth of the hearth, the companionship of Antoine. It was here, in this isolated mansion, that she had found herself, that she had found purpose. The idea of leaving this behind, of leaving Antoine behind, was a painful thought. She turned the letter over in her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. She didn't know what to do. She wanted to stay, to be with Antoine, but her family needed her. Her father, especially, would need her help. She was the only one of his children who had been able to adapt to their new life. And though her siblings had grown accustomed to luxury again, Camille knew that it was her presence, her quiet support, that had held the family together during their most difficult days. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts, and she turned to see Gabriel, the young boy who had become like a bridge between her and the world outside. Standing in the doorway, his wide eyes were filled with concern, and Camille could tell that he had noticed her distracted state. "Miss Camille," Gabriel began hesitantly. I didn't mean to disturb you, but the Baron is waiting for you in the library." Camille nodded, though she didn't move right away. She felt a strange heaviness in her chest. Gabriel, sensing her unease, lingered for a moment longer, his gaze flicking from the letter in her hand to her face. "You seem troubled," he said quietly. "If you'd like to talk, I'm sure the Baron would listen." Camille gave him a soft smile, grateful for his kindness, but the weight of her thoughts lingered. "I'll be fine," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, Gabriel." He nodded and left her to her thoughts, and for a moment, Camille stood alone, looking out at the spring garden, her heart torn. With a sigh, she tucked the letter into her pocket and made her way toward the library. The air in the library was thick with the scent of aged books and wood. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the shelves. Antoine sat at his usual place, his back to her, as he pored over a large book, his brow furrowed in concentration. For a moment, Camille stood in the doorway, watching him. There was something about him now, something that had softened in the past few months. His face, once so hard and closed off, now bore the subtle signs of someone who had begun to heal. Antoine looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that made Camille's heart ache. He didn't need to speak to know what was troubling her. "You've received word from your family," he said quietly, his voice low, almost resigned. Camille nodded, her throat tightening. She didn't need to say more. He already knew. Antoine closed the book in front of him and stood, his large frame casting a shadow across the room. "I know. It is your duty to return," he said, his voice steady, though there was a faint sadness beneath it. "But if you decide to stay, if you choose this place, I will understand." The words, simple as they were, carried an unexpected weight. Camille hadn't realized just how much his opinion mattered to her until now. He wasn't just her employer, the mysterious man who had given her refuge. He was someone she had come to care for deeply, someone she had begun to trust. The thought of leaving him behind, of returning to her old life, felt like an impossible choice. Camille hesitated, unsure of what to say. She didn't want to hurt him, but she also didn't want to turn her back on her family. "I don't know what to do." Antoine's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, he seemed almost vulnerable. "Go, Camille. You must. Your family needs you. But know this. If you return to us, to this place, it will always be here, waiting for you." The sincerity in his voice took Camille by surprise. His kindness, the quiet understanding in his words, touched her deeply. It was a kindness she hadn't expected from the man who had once been known as the Beast. She reached into her pocket, pulling out the letter once more. "I'll go, but I'll be back," she said softly, her voice filled with determination. "I promise." Antoine gave a small nod, his expression unreadable, but the warmth in his eyes told Camille all she needed to know. "Then go with my blessing, Camille," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And when you return, we will find our way forward together." Camille left the library with the letter in hand, a new sense of resolve settling in her chest. She had made her choice, but even as she walked toward the unknown, she knew one thing for sure. Her heart would always belong here, in this mansion, with the man who had come to mean so much to her. And as the first signs of spring bloomed outside, Camille knew that the journey ahead would lead her back to Antoine, to the place where she had found more than a home. She had found herself, the wedding. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the quiet village as Camille stepped out of the carriage, her heart heavy with the weight of what awaited her. The wedding, which had once seemed like a simple familial obligation, now felt like an unbearable burden. Her father's excitement, her siblings' eager chatter, it all seemed so far removed from the world she had built for herself at the mansion. It was as if she had stepped back in time, back to a life she had once known, but could never fully embrace again. Her family greeted her warmly, though there was a certain distance in their eyes, as if they too could sense the subtle changes in her. They noticed the fine clothes she wore now, the quiet confidence she carried, and the fact that she had come back with the Baron by her side, a man they still could not understand. As Camille and Antoine made their way toward the church, the villagers gathered in small clusters, gossiping behind their hands, eyes narrowing as they caught sight of the man at her side. The whispers were sharp, filled with judgment, and Camille could feel the sting of their disdain in the pit of her stomach. Antoine, ever the stoic figure, walked beside her, his presence imposing yet quiet. He didn't seem to notice the glances, the whispered mockery. But Camille did. Every rude comment, every sneer, pierced her heart like a dagger. She had come to care for him more deeply than she had ever imagined possible, and the way the villagers looked at him made her feel as though they were stabbing him with every word they spoke. As they entered the church, the villagers fell silent, their eyes turning to the towering figure that accompanied Camille. Antoine's presence filled the room, but it was not the kind of attention that any man would want. His large, beastly frame and untamed features were out of place in this village of simple, well-mannered folk. He didn't belong here, and yet Camille couldn't help but feel the fierce pride in her chest as she stood by his side, her hand gently resting on his arm. The ceremony itself was simple, rustic even, but as Camille stood at the back of the church, watching her sister exchange vows, she couldn't help but feel a gnawing emptiness in her heart. The simple life, the life that had once seemed so appealing, now felt hollow. The love that her sister shared with her new husband, the laughter and joy of the villagers, all felt like a distant dream. Camille had left that world behind. She had found something deeper, something more meaningful with Antoine, the man everyone rejected. When the ceremony ended and the villagers began to gather in the small village square for the reception, Camille could feel the tension in the air. As they approached the makeshift banquet table, the murmurs grew louder. The villagers watched from a distance, casting sideways glances at Antoine, their expressions a mix of discomfort and judgment. It wasn't long before the first comment came. A villager, an older man with a sharp gaze, leaned over to his neighbor and whispered loudly enough for Camille to hear. "Look at him," the man said with a sneer. "A beast in a suit. He's as monstrous as ever, isn't he?" The cruel words stung, and Camille's heart burned with anger. She had kept silent for so long, letting their whispers slide past her like water off a duck's back. But now, standing in the midst of it all, something inside her snapped. She couldn't stand it any longer. She turned to the crowd, her voice shaking but strong. "You all have no idea who he is," she said, her words cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "You look at him, and all you see is a beast. But you are wrong. You are all wrong. He is not a monster. He is a man, kind, intelligent, and caring. He has shown me a kindness I've never known, and he has done nothing but offer me respect and love." A hush fell over the crowd, the villagers taken aback by her sudden outburst. Camille's chest heaved with emotion as she took a step forward, her gaze fixed on the people who had once been her community. "I've watched you all for years," she continued, her voice growing louder. "I've seen how you treat him, how you reject him because of how he looks. But do you know what he's been through? Do you know what it's like to live every day in the shadows, to be cast aside because of something you cannot control?" The villagers shifted uncomfortably, some avoiding her gaze, others looking at each other with uncertainty. Camille's eyes found Antoine's, and for the first time in a long while, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a vulnerability that he had never allowed her to see before. It was as though her words had reached him. In a way, nothing else could. She turned back to the crowd, her heart pounding with emotion. "I love him, and I will defend him, no matter what any of you say." Her words rang out in the silence, and in that moment, something shifted in the air. The villagers exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond. They had never seen Camille like this before, so fierce, so certain. It was as if she had become a different person, one who would no longer let the cruelty of others define her world. And then, as if in response to her declaration, a sudden change swept through the crowd. Antoine's figure, once towering and beastly, seemed to shimmer before her eyes. His monstrous features began to blur, melting away, revealing a man she had never fully seen before. His face became softer, his features more refined, and his eyes, once full of sorrow and darkness, now held a spark of life, of humanity. He was handsome, more handsome than she had ever imagined. The transformation was so sudden, so powerful, that Camille gasped. She took a step toward him, her breath caught in her throat. Her heart raced as she reached for him, her hand trembling as she touched his face. His skin was warm beneath her fingers, the roughness of his old appearance now gone. In that moment, as their eyes locked, she knew this was not just the end of his curse. It was the beginning of something new, something beautiful. "I told you," Camille whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You are not a monster. You never were." And in that instant, the last vestige of the beast was gone, leaving only the man she had come to love, the man who had transformed before her eyes, not just in appearance but in spirit. The curse was broken not by magic or fate, but by love. Her love, his love, their love. The villagers, once so quick to judge, now stood in stunned silence, witnessing the miracle before them. And for the first time, they saw Antoine for what he truly was, a man, not a monster. The air seemed to hum with the energy of something profound, something that had changed forever. Camille smiled through her tears, her heart swelling with pride. She had defended him, and in doing so, had unlocked the love and humanity that had always been inside him. Together they stood, no longer a beast and a girl, but two souls bound together by something far more powerful than any curse. The wedding, once filled with discomfort and rejection, now seemed like the beginning of something much more meaningful. A new chapter in their lives, one where love and acceptance would reign above all. A new beginning. The first rays of dawn painted the sky with soft hues of pink and gold as Camille and Antoine returned to the chateau, their hearts light with the promise of a new beginning. The towering gates of the estate, once a symbol of isolation and mystery, now stood open, welcoming them back as a home, a place where love had triumphed over darkness. The cold winter had passed, and with it, the oppressive weight of the curse that had bound Antoine for so long. What remained now was a new chapter, one not defined by shadows, but by the warmth of acceptance and the quiet strength of their bond. As they entered the chateau, Camille couldn't help but look at it differently. The grand hall that once seemed so cold and foreboding now felt like a sanctuary. The long corridors that had echoed with silence were now filled with the gentle sounds of their footsteps, each step a testament to the life they had built together. The mansion, once a prison for Antoine, had become a symbol of their shared resilience, a place where both of them had found the freedom to be their true selves. Camille glanced at Antoine, her heart swelling with affection as he walked beside her, no longer the beast that had once terrified her, but the man she had always known was there. His features, once so harsh and untamed, were now refined. His face, a portrait of kindness and strength. His eyes, once clouded with sorrow, now gleamed with the light of someone who had found peace within himself. "Are you happy here?" Camille asked softly, her voice barely more than a whisper as they strolled through the grand entryway, the echo of their steps a comforting rhythm. Antoine turned to her, a gentle smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I am Camille," he said, his voice steady and warm. "I never knew how much I needed this. I thought I was cursed. But it turns out the only thing I was truly missing was the understanding that I was worthy of love." Camille reached out, taking his hand in hers, feeling the steady pulse of his warmth against her skin. It was a simple gesture, but in it lay everything she had come to understand about their journey together. She had learned that love wasn't always about grand declarations or dramatic transformations. It was about acceptance, about seeing the humanity in each other and embracing it despite the flaws and imperfections that came with it. Together they had unraveled the darkness of their pasts and woven something stronger in its place. "The chateau is ours now," she said, looking up at the towering structure that had once seemed so imposing. "It feels different, doesn't it?" Antoine nodded, his gaze sweeping over the familiar yet transformed landscape. "Yes, it's no longer a place of solitude and regret. It's our home." The words lingered between them, filling the space with a quiet reverence. They had both changed in ways neither had expected when they first met. Camille, once a girl unsure of her place in the world, had become a woman who knew what it meant to love and sacrifice. Antoine, a man once trapped by his own bitterness and pride, had been freed by her compassion, his heart now open to the possibility of happiness. Together, they had created something beautiful out of the brokenness that had once defined their lives. The chateau, once a dark and lifeless place, was now a vibrant reflection of their love, a place where laughter and warmth would fill the halls, where the shadows of the past would no longer hold sway. As the days passed, their lives at the chateau unfolded with a sense of peace Camille had never imagined possible. The once barren gardens, so carefully tended to by Antoine's mother, began to bloom again, their colors vibrant and alive. Camille spent her days in the garden, her hands buried in the rich soil, planting flowers that would bring joy to their home. Antoine, too, found solace in the small things, the sound of birds chirping in the trees, the soft rustle of the wind through the leaves, the warmth of the sun on his face. These were the moments that had once seemed distant and unreachable, but now they were his to savor. The library, once a symbol of Antoine's isolation, became a place where they both spent hours, reading together and sharing stories. Antoine had always been a man of books, but now he found joy in reading not just for knowledge, but for the simple pleasure of companionship. They would sit by the fire, surrounded by the ancient volumes that had once filled his heart with longing, now a source of shared discovery and quiet joy. At night, they would sit together under the stars, their hands intertwined, talking about their dreams for the future. They no longer needed to hide their feelings behind walls of fear or pride. Their love was open, honest, and without pretense. The bond between them had only grown stronger with time, rooted in a foundation of trust and mutual respect. Camille had come to understand something profound. Love was not about perfection. It was about seeing each other for who they truly were, accepting the darkness along with the light, and choosing to walk forward together, hand in hand. In Antoine, she had found not just a man, but a partner who saw her for who she was and loved her without question. And in herself, she had found a strength she never knew she possessed. The strength to love despite the odds, to fight for what was right, and to create a life that was worth living. The curse that had once bound Antoine was gone, but the love they had shared, the growth they had both experienced, would remain forever. They had broken free of the past, and in doing so, they had created a future that was brighter than anything either of them had ever imagined. As the seasons passed, the chateau blossomed with life. The roses, once a symbol of pain and loss, now bloomed abundantly in the garden, their petals a vibrant reflection of the love that had healed them both. The mansion, once a place of cold isolation, had become a sanctuary, a place where two souls, once lost in the darkness, had found their way back to the light. And so, Camille and Antoine stood at the threshold of a new beginning, a future filled with hope and possibility. Together, they had overcome the odds, and in each other, they had found the greatest treasure of all, the freedom to love, to heal, and to be whole. With a final shared smile, they turned toward the garden, ready to embrace the future hand in hand. The past was behind them, and the promise of a new beginning awaited.